The Last of Us Part 2 is a difficult game to categorize. Coming off the massive success of Part 1, the game faced a huge problem. The game's key narrative points were leaked prior to the game's release and causing a huge uproar. This frustrated a lot of gamers who felt that Naughty Dog betrayed them, and I was one of them. However, after playing the title, I can say that the game's narrative evoked a lot of different emotions, ranging from anger, frustration, and even sometimes glee. All pointed towards the new character, Abby, whose introduction is done so poorly that it's hard to connect with her. Ellie still remains a significant part of the narrative, but adding such an unlikable character to the mix definitely makes the experience less appealing than Part 1. The gameplay remains largely loyal to the original, with improvements made to the game's AI, the infected getting a terrifying update in both visual and sound design, and better level design that encourages exploration. The Last of Us Part 2 is a marvelous game, but it'll make you feel a lot of emotions that you probably don't want to feel when playing a video game. The Last of Us Part 2 takes place 4 years after the events of Part 1. Ellie is now living in Jackson and has matured as a person. She's no longer the quirky girl who occasionally tells bad jokes. Instead, she is more hardened and is living in this expansive community. Since the events of the first game, Ellie has developed strong bonds with the community, with Jackson teaming with businesses, people, and even children. People have started to rebuild their lives, but the fear of the cordyceps infection is still real. Regular patrols are made outside the walls and to lookout points to ensure the community is well stocked and protected by both bandits and the infected. The two closest people to Ellie are introduced very early. Jesse is a strong leader that puts the needs of others above his own, and Dina is a charming girl who has a great romantic interest in Ellie. Some of the previous characters do return, but most of the focus is put on the new characters. The biggest being Abby. This very strong woman commits a horrible act within the first chapter of the game. It is such a vile act against the players who played the first game that it leaves a permanent impression on this character. What follows is Ellie leading a covert operation to Seattle to take revenge against Abby and her people for this act, which I won't say for the sake of spoilers, but if you've seen the leaks, you already know what it is. The theme of this game is revenge, and it is constantly hammered into the player's skull. Not only is the main narrative about vengeance, but plenty of optional documents and human enemies will reinforce this theme, with enemies calling out for their fallen enemy by name, or learning about how someone locked a bunch of people in a spore-riddled area because he hated them for what they did to him. The writing team was not subtle about this in the slightest, and it kind of overdoes the whole theme of revenge to the point that it becomes almost a cliche. Perhaps this was intentional or not, but Abby remains the low point of the story due to her introduction. Since she commits such a terrible act, not only to the main cast, but to those who played the first game, it's hard than ever to connect to Abby past this event. Abby is shown to be another person surviving in this world. She has flaws, but also has people she loves and cares about. Despite this, the developers are trying really hard, and I mean really hard, to try and develop a connection between the player and Abby, but personally, I just could not look past who she is and what she did, and it's extremely hard to see anyone else doing the same, especially those who enjoyed Part 1.
Not at any cost.
It didn't matter that she loved dogs or that she lost someone important. She was responsible for everything that was transpiring. Worse than all, I had to control her. Ellie's part of the adventure is more or less what you would expect, with her hunting down these people throughout Seattle. The Last of Us Part 2's narrative isn't that amazing when you talk about it. The same can be said about Part 1. It was the incredible characters, writing, and choreography that made the experience so memorable, and that's still to an extent here. The voice acting and character models are perfect, and coupled with each scene is a complimentary musical score that heightens each moment, and you have a recipe for cinematic gold. Each scene in this game is both jarring from a technical perspective and from a viewer perspective. Naughty Dog went above and beyond with these scenes with lifelike movement and gestures. The eye movement and body language in particular were so eerie because they were just so lifelike. And that translates to some grotesque scenes of brutality as Naughty Dog animated and crafted such high quality violence that I actually cringed a few times. That being said, the story will not appeal to everyone. In fact, it will cause a lot of vexation. The emotional roller coaster that this story will take you on will not be easy, especially for fans of the first game. But one thing is for certain, this game's story will make you feel something, and it probably won't be good. Much of the gameplay in Part 2 remains loyal to Part 1 with slight adjustments. Players still sneak or shoot their way through various sets of enemies, all while collecting material to craft items and increase your character's weapons and passive skills. Unlike Part 1, Naughty Dog has expanded on the layers of exploration and added slight changes to both combat and stealth. Now players can jump and go prone. Jumping allows you to access more areas and take better vantage points. It may seem small, but Naughty Dog really took advantage of these new mobility options. This can also be said for going prone. When prone, Ellie and Abby can hide in small patches of grass and crawl into small areas. All of this is used in exploration, and there are more opportunities to locate supplies. Like Part 1, you're strongly encouraged to search for supplies to craft items, but in Part 2, the options are much higher. There are optional areas that you can entirely miss that sometimes offer new weapons and upgrades, with saves having the best supplies and requiring you to search the environment for the code. Naughty Dog took reference from Red Dead Redemption 2 with the characters picking up items directly from the exact position the item is located instead of just sticking their hand out in the general location. It's pretty impressive. Both Ellie and Abby have unique options in terms of upgrades, but mostly similar skill trees. By obtaining pills, you can unlock accessible trees, but magazines aren't needed to unlock new hidden trees. Scrap is used for weapons, and you're given a fair selection of upgrades, with both Ellie and Abby having distinguished weapons. All weapons have 4 upgrades that increase capacity, damage, stability, and so on. Instead of just using standard animations to upgrade the weapon like in Part 1, you actually see Ellie and Abby making the modification, which is a very nice touch. Overall, the upgrade system is basic, but it does work. The enemies you'll encounter are varied and have unique fighting patterns. You'll encounter both infected and humans, with most of them being human, either from the Washington Liberation Front or the Seraphites, better known as Scars. The WLF are military-focused militia who overthrew the military in the Seattle quarantine zone and now scavenge Seattle. They're organized and use similar techniques as the military, such as dogs, to sniff out the player's position. The Seraphites are a cult that live on an island outside of Seattle but entered the city for supplies. They believe that the infection is a response to human sin. They utilize mostly sneaky weapons such as bows and use long-range weapons such as rifles. They're best known for their effective non-verbal communication technique of whistling to issue commands and locate potential allies who may or may not be dead. Both sides hate each other and are fighting one another for control of Seattle. Ellie is right in the middle and Abby is part of the WLF. The biggest threat, of course, is still the infected. Naughty Dog made the infected even more terrifying, with redesigns made to the character models to make them even more inhuman, and their combat techniques reflect this change. Runners, the first stage of infection, are still hyper-aggressive, but now will take full advantage of the new combat system. Now you can dodge incoming blows, but it also works both ways, with the player no longer able to spam melee strikes. This makes runners even more threatening, and also standard humans. Clickers, the most notorious of the infected, now curl their arms to resemble a mantis, while also using this horrifying screech occasionally. They're still blind, but their hyper hearing makes sneaking up on them even more difficult. Stalkers still focus on hit and run tactics, often hiding in tall grass and behind cover, or even fusing into the wall, waiting for potential victims to pass by, it had me terrified and scared to walk past walls that showcased this character model. Shamblers are the new infected, made possible thanks to Seattle's increased rainfall, filling the air with corrosive spores when they're near a target. Thanks to their heavy armor, you'll need to aim for the head to deal any real damage, but they'll explode when killed. The bloaters have seen the biggest change. Now these heavily infected creatures act like mini-bosses with increased speed and defenses. The creature can easily smash through concrete walls, like in Part 1. If you are grabbed, you are instantly killed. There is one last infection I cannot talk about, but it was so gruesome that it looked like it came out of Resident Evil. Overall, I was incredibly impressed of how well Naughty Dog was able to recreate the sensations found playing a survival horror game within The Last of Us Part 2. So much so, I wouldn't be surprised if they decided to probably dive into this genre because it was so well done here. There will be situations where you can pit everyone against one another, leading to large calamities that give you the advantage of sneaking off or taking out some of the enemies in your way. Ellie and Abby can shoot their way through hordes of enemies, but you are strongly encouraged to sneak, which is essential to save supplies on harder difficulties. If you decide to just shoot your way through the game, the title plays like a third-person shooter. Unlike most shooters, you actively sway your gun back and forth, and the recoil plays a larger role in helping you stabilize your aim. If you shoot your gun repeatedly, your target and reticle will move all over the place, making it much harder for you to hit that essential headshot. Enemies will take notice when your guns are empty and charge your position when they hear that click sound, so it's important to keep awareness about how much ammo you have. That being said, enemies tend to have incredible levels of accuracy when in combat. In addition, it's very clear that these enemies have fully upgraded weapons considering their rate of fire and stopping power, sometimes knocking Ellie off her feet. Killing enemies is very bloody, and if you cause severe damage such as a rifle that shoots up NPC's arm, it will literally go flying from the point of impact, with some enemies even yelling out in pain before dying. This game is graphic. The blood patterns from high explosive kills were disturbing as blood, guts, and sometimes even brain matter would be scattered around the arena. I don't know what the developers had to do or see to research to replicate this, and I don't want to know. The violence here is incredibly disturbing and something that is hard to ignore. Weapon variety is what you would expect. 2 pistols and a handful of powerful weapons such as a bow, rifle, shotgun, flamethrower, and so on. You can upgrade each of these weapons with the exception of the flamethrower, with the pistol being able to be outfitted with a silencer. But for some reason you can only carry one silencer and you can't swap out one silencers for a new one. So if you have a position where you can pick up a bottle and craft a brand new silencer, you can't do it because reasons. You can't sneak, which is often a more ideal option, but it also comes with its own issues. First off, enemies often communicate with one another, similar to Metal Gear Solid 5, but unlike in that game where reports with time to maintain fairness, here NPCs will often notice one another is gone almost instantly. It didn't happen all the time, but often I would kill someone and then another would call out for that person's name immediately, wondering where they went. It can feel very overwhelming as enemy counts get very high during the later part of the game. If you do happen to screw up, checkpoints are fairly distributed and getting back to a recent encounter is quick. Granted, sneaking has been improved with new options. You can now crouch and remain hidden in tall grass and go prone to remain hidden in short grass. But if enemies get too close, they can see you. Sometimes you'll be given a shallow amount of water where you can literally swim underneath and avoid detection, provided the enemy isn't right next to you. When facing infected, you'll have to utilize these techniques in different ways. Since these creatures are primal, Naughty Dog took that into consideration. They will often violently just charge your position, with the exception of runners and stalkers who will actively use cover and dodge in order to avoid being hit, because technically the cordyceps infection, they are still aware of who they are, they're just not controlling their body, which is truly horrifying. You can still use bottles and bricks in order to lure infected, but here it's a little more difficult as enemies will often investigate it, but then they will change their pattern. Human enemies will only send one enemy in order to locate the origin of the sound, while multiple enemies guard their position, which adds another layer of what can you do and how you should tackle these objectives. Both Ellie and Abby have distinct sneaking techniques, with Ellie able to use her mother's knife for quick kills, but Abby having to rely on shivs and her powerful arms to break necks, making clickers a much more formidable threat for Abby. Many of the areas are designed with multiple avenues of travel. Yes, there's still one exit, but how you get to that exit is up to you. The developers provided many options for how you can get there. Often you'll have to make quick decisions when traversing the environment to avoid being boxed in, as human enemies will try and flank and ambush you when spotted, creating a lot of dynamic situations as you determine the best course of action. Getting to the exit can be a bit annoying as the game doesn't always telegraph where you have to go. During my first playthrough, I got lost several times and became so frustrated with sneaking around enemies, I decided just to kill anyone and just find the exit that way. Occasionally the game will pose some environmental challenges, the first being avoiding traps connected to explosives. At first this seems challenging as you have to avoid the devices, but you can simply throw bottles or shoot them with little consequence. This could have been an interesting section where you actively avoided detection, but no. New to The Last of Us Part 2 are boss fights. I mean, you can technically say that the fight with David from Part 1 was a boss encounter, but here they are actually challenging fights against deadly opponents. These encounters often require you to fully use all the skills and evade being killed while dishing out attacks. I cannot say more without risking spoilers, but these are large cinematic affairs and are extremely well done. The partner system from Part 1 is still here. Occasionally Ellie and Abby will have partners who join them on their adventure and aid them in combat. When it comes to killing enemies, they are quite effective, but when it comes to helping you when you're grappled, they're not exactly the most helpful in that regard. In fact, just watch this. So yeah, the partner system is hit and miss, but it's still here and it works for the most part. The gameplay is equal parts challenging, fun, and frustrating. However, Naughty Dog has provided ample ways to adjust difficulty instead of just standard modes. This extends to accessibility options, which change the gameplay to adapt to large amounts of mobility or sensation limitations. Overall, the gameplay for The Last of Us Part 2 isn't flawless, but it does build on a lot of positive qualities that the first one had. I did wish the enemy count was a bit smaller and sneaking was made less stressful. Not to mention enemies being a little less aware than just immediately you killing someone and them saying, "Where's Frank?" It's just a little bizarre that you kill someone and they immediately know that the person is gone. It does break the immersion. But the gameplay is very solid and I compliment Naughty Dog for taking initiative in order to build on the previous game's shortcomings, especially in the exploration attributes. The musical score for The Last of Us Part 2 is a bit fickle for me. It's amazing, but it's also forgettable. After replaying the game twice, I didn't remember a single track, which was a bit ironic because after completing the first game, the opposite was true. The reason was that the musical tracks played so well with the scenes that I was often seeing everything combined as one, instead of just picking out certain aspects of what was happening, such as the character's dialogue, or the musical score. I was instead completely immersed in the scenes, whether it was gameplay or cinematic. It's a strange balance that just works in the game's favor. I don't remember any of the tracks because they merged so well with the scene that I just didn't take notice from one thing over another. It was just combined for something amazing, and yes, the musical score did a fantastic job of complementing the scenes and the gameplay, so great job Naughty Dog on that regard. Part 2's most defining quality is the game's technical systems. The game looks and plays amazing. The sheer amount of detail in this game is staggering. Frogs jumping in watery areas, ice breaking at the point where your horse's feet land, enemies crying out in pain when dying from fatal wounds, and how glass shatters. I mean, these are only a few examples, but the game is a technical masterpiece. The visuals are amazing, the character models are so expressive even in gameplay, with the characters actively expressing their emotions in both their facial and body movements. For example, as your health drops, your character will actually breathe more heavily and their movements will reflect this. Resident Evil did this since the beginning, but here it's done at a much greater degree, and it's a little unsettling to see Ellie continuously gasping for air as her health depletes. I've already expressed how grotesque the infected look as blood oozes down their misshaped mouths or the starker skin slowly peeling away as the fungus sprouts from their back. But seriously, these things look like they belong in the survival horror game of how well designed they are. The first game was pretty cool of how they were designed, but they weren't that terrifying. But here, they are straight out of nightmares. From a technical perspective, this game is a masterpiece. There's little doubt about that, and it's really hard to argue against it. The only very small complaint I had from a technical perspective is the load times when loading into a new chapter. It can take a long time, but this was only from chapter selection. If you play the game from start to finish, load times are very quick and seamless, so you don't have to worry about that. The Last of Us Part 2 made me angry, sad, disappointed, happy, an array of other emotions during this 18-hour journey. Perhaps this was all intentional, to make us hate Abby, but to show that she's no different from the other characters in this world. Either way, it felt forced and distasteful for these characters to essentially take the place of someone more beloved. The gameplay has its moments of extreme stress and challenge as you fend off both infected and human enemies alike using techniques to take advantage of each enemy's weaknesses, which had been updated to accommodate the new mobility and melee system. However, the overall concepts have remained largely unchanged, and the removal of the nail bomb, which I personally loved, was particularly heartbreaking. The Last of Us Part 2 is a dark and bloody tale that will likely leave many feeling dread and anger by the end of this game, but one thing is hard to argue about this title. It makes you feel things that a video game can rarely accomplish, and perhaps that was the intention of Naughty Dog all along. So whether you love it or hate it, you will feel something by the end of The Last of Us Part 2.